Hi, it's Nicole, and today I'm talking about the books I read in January. The first book I read in January was The Afrominimalist's Guide to Living with Less, which I already did a review for, so I'll put that in the cards and in the description box. And then after that, I got straight into my New Year's resolution to read more personal finance books. I figured that maybe I could read 3 for the year, or maybe even 5. I ended up reading quite a lot just in January alone. And the first book that I started to read was Dave Ramsey's Total Money Makeover, which I thought was pretty awful. I did not get on with that book at all. I think in the first place it just wasn't for me because there was a huge focus on debt, which isn't an issue that I've ever had. But that aside, I felt like his personality was just not one that I got on with well, and I think I got about a third into the book when he said something that was kind of a non-comment. It wasn't controversial or anything like that, but it made me want to look into him more, and I did. And he seems like a person that I wouldn't get on with very well. So after that, I was questioning why I was even trying to continue with this book that just seemed really awful, and there's probably better personal finance books out there. And to be honest, the reason that I picked this book up in the first place, even though everything about it screams not for Nicole, is that one of the YouTubers that I follow, he recommended it and really liked it, and I like that YouTuber, he seems cool and stuff, but I feel like I should kind of file this away into book recommendations from bros, because there are a lot of guys out there who are, you know, here on the old internet, recommending books that I guess from their perspective seem fine, but from my perspective just seem unaware and unnuanced, to say the least. There's one book in particular that comes to mind that continually gets recommended by bros, and it's like they don't realize that there's a section in that book that's very problematic for women. And I can see why they wouldn't recognize that, but at the same time, it just feels like there's a section of book recommendations that come with this caveat of like, I mean, that guy's nice and all, but it doesn't really get it. Anyway, that's enough for that tangent. I mean, I could do a whole video about my thoughts on that, but that's not this video. After that, I had a personal finance palette cleanse with the Clever Girl Finance book, Grow Your Money by Bola, Sokunbi, and this one was really good. I think this was a really good intro into investment for the everyday person, and my only real complaint, which isn't really a criticism of the book itself, is that it's super America focused, and understandably, I feel like personal finance in general has to be pretty tailored for each country because we obviously have different tax laws in different countries, so that's completely understandable. It's just kind of frustrating when you're trying to deal with personal finance outside of the US because it feels like there are fewer resources. I felt like this book does a really good job of not being too obnoxious Silicon Valley bro type style, and also not being like dry Wall Street square kind of style. And I actually wasn't sure going into this because some of the reviews for her previous book, which I think is more generally about money and even more introductory than this, I saw some of the complaints for that was that it's too stereotypically feminine, talking about like shoes and shopping and that kind of thing, and very fluffy, and that is absolutely not something that I wanted. But this book didn't really have much of that in. I think there's 2 mentions of like Chanel or bags or something like that, which isn't relatable to me, but it wasn't overwhelmingly throughout the book or anything like that, so that was fine. I should probably mention that I listened to all of these books on audiobook, and this is one I think I'd like to buy the hard copy of to refer to in future. Next I read We Need to Talk About Money by Otegha Uwagba, and this one I expected to be more of like a reference book, kind of like her book The Little Black Book, which was sort of a handbook for freelancing women. This one turned out to actually be a memoir, and although that wasn't what I was looking for, I still found it really insightful. Her perspective on privilege was really interesting to look at because it's kind of like she had one foot in each doorway. Is that the phrase? I don't know. But she talks about the way that being brought up in a boarding school that she was only able to be in because of her academic achievement and not because of being able to financially afford that, ended up sort of distorting her idea of money and salary expectations and career expectations and those kinds of things later. The things in this that were really relatable and the things in this that were completely unrelatable were equally as interesting to me, and I really liked her shrewd critical analysis of society, especially as it relates to money and being a young person today. It was definitely a really interesting addition to the discussion that's going on in my head about personal finance, even though it was a memoir and not a reference book. Then I read A Bookshop in Algiers by Kaouther Adimi for Invisible Cities Project, and I will put the review for that in the cards and in the description box. Next was Anything You Want by Derek Sivers, and this again goes in the recommendations from bros category, which it was fine. It was fine. And then we have Do the Work by Stephen Pressfield, and I actually liked this book even though I didn't think I would. I thought it would just, this again is recommendations from bros, and you can already see how white and male all of these bro recommendations are. Make of that what you will. But this book surprised me and I actually liked it. At the moment I'm thinking through a graphic novel idea, and there are some tips in here for just getting started on big, intimidating projects of that nature, and I found those little tips kind of helpful, and I think I'm probably going to reread this before launching into the scripting phase for that, so I found this useful. Then we have Art Inc., The Essential Guide for Building Your Career as an Artist by Lisa Congdon. Lisa Congdon is a huge name in the creative industry. She is known, I guess, for having started her career a little later in life and becoming a runaway success. She's worked with a lot of huge brands, and I think she's mostly in the kind of surface design and stationery and interiors and kind of that sort of space. So not exactly my industry, but I just thought it would be interesting to pick this up anyway. I really like stories that focus away from youth centricism, things that kind of look at people starting careers later in life, or just people's experiences later in life. And by later in life, I don't even mean that much later. I mean literally anything where you're over 25 is like, oh my god, like who writes about people over 25, you know what I mean? So that was kind of interesting to pick up, but I didn't necessarily find it super useful. I feel like this would be useful for people closer to what she does creatively rather than what I do, but there were still helpful things for people who would want to do illustration or get into publishing or anything like that. I think there are a lot of basics that were really helpful for people just starting a career. If you are interested in doing gallery shows or having an online shop or prepping your traditional media for display online, this would be a really good book to pick up. And again, if you are not yet fully in the creative industry, I think this is good intro and answers a few of those starter sort of questions and is good for people at any stage of life. Next was Enough, True Measures of Money, Business and Life by John C. Bogle. And he's the founder, I guess, or co-founder or something of Vanguard, which is a big deal in the finance world. They came up with index funds for stock, blah, blah, blah. So he's like a totally really important dude or whatever. I would file this away into bro recommendations, except it wasn't, but it feels like it would be, right? But this one popped up in my script suggestions because I was reading all those other bro recommendations. And it was pretty good. I appreciated it for several reasons. I didn't really expect the emphasis on society and people over profit or any of the ideas about responsibility to society. I wasn't expecting that from this guy. I feel like one of the biggest things that this book actually made me think about was nothing to do with finance at all. It was to do with political attitudes and the fact that he is a Republican in more of an old school kind of way, in my opinion, where it's like the Overton window is a little bit more in the center and a little bit more balanced, because it's interesting to see all of the crossover in agreement that you can have with someone on the other side of the political spectrum, where it's not like just these wild extremes that we're seeing now. after, just looking at his Wikipedia page. And he describes himself as Republican, and yet in recent years he had been voting for certain Democrats, which to me is kind of interesting in that, again, this is something that I feel like I could go into a whole video about, but in the US, I would say that the left-leaning party is still pretty center-right compared to how a lot of Europe is positioned, for example. At least that's the general idea that tends to be accepted. This was interesting to see a more reasonable Republican pop up after so many years of being kind of flooded with right-wing extremism in the mainstream. So this was really interesting for a lot of political reasons to me, even though that was not at all the focus of this book. But also from a finance perspective, I found this book kind of interesting. But at the same time, if you don't have, like me, a New Year's resolution to read more personal finance books, I don't know that this would necessarily be a riveting hit with you. So I don't know if I would recommend it like that, but I appreciated it. Then we have Minimal Finance, Forging Your Own Path to Financial Freedom by Sam Dixon-Brown, and this was fine. It was not groundbreaking or anything. I mean, it just, basically it's a very short book that was too long, in my opinion, just basically saying, be really frugal and don't worry about your lattes. Look at the bigger expenses you have, like, do you need to be renting? Can you live with your parents? Or be extremely frugal for a while to save a bunch, and then, like, it just felt really basic, but it was fine. Then we have David Allen's Getting Things Done, The Art of Stress-Free Productivity. This was authentically a bro recommendation as well, and I can definitely see why it's considered the productivity Bible. It is exhaustive in its approach. It feels like categorization of everything and organization of everything and filtering things and all of the stuff. I don't know that I would necessarily recommend this one though, and at times it just felt really dry and like it was going on too long, and my preference is probably Anna Newton's An Edited Life. But I think if you want to get really into the weeds of all that you could possibly do to manage every minute of your life or whatever, I guess, then yeah, this one is probably a good pickup for you. Then we have The Half God of Rainfall by Inua Ellams, and I loved this. I was really surprised by this because, for one, I don't feel super comfortable with poetry in general. It really does still intimidate me, and on top of that, I was going to be listening to it, which I think is good and bad in a way. It's really great because I feel like listening to people perform their work can be really moving and can sometimes be the best way to consume poetry, but at the same time it also means that it's also going at a pace that might be faster than I feel like I can keep up with in terms of like getting everything. So it was one of those things where I wasn't sure if this would be the best way to approach this book, but in the end I'm really glad that I listened to it on audiobook. I could just ignore all of the overanalyzing of things and trying to like reread the lines several times to really get all of the references and all of that stuff, and just go with the flow of it and get into the story. And I really liked it. It was basically looking at both the European and African gods and a clash between them, and the story felt both steeped in that kind of old world tradition as well as the contemporary world, and that was just, I thought it was really skillfully done, so I would actually recommend this one. And we are almost to the end, don't worry. Next I read Yoke My Yoga of Self-Acceptance by Jessamyn Stanley, and this was really good. I love that even though she feels strongly spiritual, she's also inclusive, which sadly doesn't always go together, but I think some of that comes from how irreverent she is as well. Despite that strong spirituality, felt very relatable and calming and like a friend, but I think her voice, as in her literary voice, felt very casual but not in a cheesy way. And it's possible that if I were just reading this and not listening to her read it out loud, it might sound cheesier on the page than it does when she's actually talking. I don't know. And I liked her being just authentically her. and being really honest and vulnerable about things and about her insecurities and about hypocrisies that she notices in other people and herself. I like the idea of just taking what you need from anything, and not having to be tied to taking the whole of everything if you don't need it. So that goes for religion, that goes for yoga, that goes for life in general. I like that she was able to bring up certain questions about the practice of yoga, cultural appropriation versus appreciation, those blurred lines, and not necessarily have an answer for everything, but not be afraid to ask the question even though she didn't have an answer for everything. And she's having, like all of us, to act and operate in the world without necessarily having answers about whether what we're doing is what we should be doing in a way. And I don't really know much about her, but I thought I would like her before picking up this book, and then I think just a few pages in, I was just like, yeah, she's amazing. I love her. Then I read Black Imagination by Natasha, Marin, and that was interesting. It was a lot of different people's perspective. It was edited by Natasha Marin, and it was a lot of different perspectives on what the Black imagination is or could be, but I feel like liked it would be a weird way to phrase it. At times it was really sad to hear people's experiences and know how relatable I found them, and also for some of them how unrelatable I found them. I know all of that sounds really vague, but if you are looking for a short book to pick up this Black History Month, this might be a good one. And lastly, I read She of the Mountains by Vivek Shraya. This one was okay, but I feel like it had far less impact because I had already read Vivek Shraya's I'm Afraid of Men, and it had a lot of the same themes and some scenes that felt basically exactly the same, and I'm not sure about how the mysticism parts were included, the bits about gods and myth and whatnot. I'm not sure that really worked for me, and on top of all of it, I wish I hadn't listened to this one on audiobook, because, and this is gonna maybe sound bad, I don't know, but I just don't feel like a very contemporary North American accent does it justice. And what I mean by that is, I don't know if you know that meme where it's talking about certain actors who it's just impossible to see them in a period piece because it's like this person has a face that has seen texting. Like, it feels like that. It felt like that listening to Vivek Shraya, particularly in those passages that talk about the gods and myths and things like that. And maybe that works still for other people, especially if you're thinking about those passages brought into a contemporary time, but it just didn't work that well for me. So I don't know about that one. That's all the books that I read in January, and by read I mean listened to, because I listened to every single one of them on Scribd. And that was a pretty productive reading month for me. I feel like the beginning of the year tends to be pretty good for me in terms of reading. But that's all for now, and I'll see you again next time. Bye.